A racist doctor named Stephen Grant. A black woman's treatment convinced her swollen abdomen was nothing serious. A few days later, something happened that he never expected. The woman he declined to treat actually have a life-threatening condition. Would he find the courage to make things right? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. A seasoned doctor named Stephen Grant believed he was at the peak of his career, but there was a darkness within his achievements. Known for his skill and discipline, Dr. Grant had a sterling reputation until one day that began to change in ways he never saw coming. Dr. Grant strode down the hospital hallway, his white coat neatly pressed, each step purposeful and sharp. The sound of his polished shoes echoing off the sterile walls. Nurses and junior doctors instinctively moved out of his way, their gazes lowered, partly out of respect, partly out of fear. Dr. Grant was revered as one of the best in his field, his hands known to be steady, his mind keen. But behind that crisp professional exterior lay an unsettling prejudice, one that few dared to confront. He approached an examination room, flipping through the chart for his next patient. His mouth tightened as he scanned the name, Mrs. Paula Brown. Dismissing her as another case that would waste his time, Dr. Grant barely hid his irritation. As he entered the room, his eyes fell on Paula, a black woman seated on the exam table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gaze was one of both fear and hope, searching for a solution to the pain she couldn't ignore. But Dr. Grant didn't notice her desperation, only his own biases clouding his view. "What seems to be the issue today, Mrs. Brown?" he asked, his tone distant and clipped. Paula's voice was quiet, edged with anxiety. "I've been having sharp pains in my abdomen, and it's getting worse." She met his gaze, hoping for understanding, for some validation of her fears. Dr. Grant barely glanced at her as he flipped through her chart with a dismissive sigh. "It's likely nothing serious," he said coolly. "Maybe it's indigestion or cramps. Have you tried some over-the-counter pain medication?" His response was curt, and he spoke as if there was nothing more to discuss. Paula's expression faltered. "But, doctor, this feels different. I've never had pain like this before," she replied, trying to make him understand. With visible impatience, he cut her off. "Mrs. Brown, if it were truly serious, you'd know. Just rest, take painkillers, and see your regular doctor if it persists," he said, barely looking at her as he turned to leave. His words left Paula stunned, her hope dashed as he exited the room without a second glance. The next day, Paula returned to the clinic, her discomfort having only worsened. Her abdomen was now visibly swollen beneath her loose-fitting blouse, and each step seemed to bring fresh waves of pain. As she entered Dr. Grant's office, he glanced up, his face instantly hardening. "Mrs. Brown back again?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. Paula winced as she lowered herself into the chair across from him, her breathing shallow. "Dr. Grant, the pain is so much worse today. My abdomen, it's swollen and I can barely walk." Dr. Grant crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes. "Mrs. Brown, I told you yesterday this isn't serious. Are you here looking for more attention or maybe stronger medication?" Paula's shoulders slumped, her eyes brimming with frustration and fear. "Doctor, please, I'm really scared. This isn't normal for me," she whispered, her voice breaking. But Dr. Grant dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand, an icy impatience tightening his expression. "Listen, Mrs. Brown," he replied, his tone sharp. "I've seen plenty of people like you. You're probably not used to proper medical care, but that doesn't give you the right to waste my time over minor discomforts." The words stung, leaving Paula feeling exposed and belittled. She tried once more to appeal to his compassion, but her voice was now barely audible, choked by a lump in her throat. "Please, just look again?" "Enough," he snapped, cutting her off. "Take some pain relievers, rest, and stop exaggerating. There are real patients with real problems who need my attention." As she stood, defeated and humiliated, Paula moved slowly toward the door. Dr. Grant's words echoed behind her, cruel and dismissive. "And next time, Mrs. Brown, try not to be so dramatic." Leaving the clinic, Paula felt a mixture of shame and anger twist within her. Her abdomen throbbed, the pain now a constant, her gnawing reminder of her helplessness. She had tried to trust Dr. Grant, but his dismissal only made her feel more alone. Later that day, As Dr. Grant returned home, he barely noticed his daughter, Sophie, bursting through the front door, her backpack swinging as she called out, "Dad, I'm home." Dr. Grant greeted her with a weary smile. "Hey, sweetheart, how was school?" Sophie's face lit up as she launched into a story about her day. "It was amazing, Dad. My friend Mia and I got paired up for our science project, and we're going to build a model of the solar system. Isn't that cool?" Dr. Grant nodded absently, his mind still on the events of his day. "That's great, honey. Mia, is it? Have I met her before?" Rolling her eyes, Sophie laughed. "Dad, Mia's my best friend. I've told you about her a million times." Dr. Grant chuckled, ruffling her hair as they moved into the kitchen. "Of course, I remember now," he replied, though his thoughts drifted back to his patients. "Dad, did you know Mia's mom works 2 jobs?" Sophie continued. "She's always helping Mia with homework, even when she's exhausted. Mia says her mom hasn't been feeling well lately, but she's still always there for her." Dr. Grant's attention shifted as a faint glimmer of curiosity crossed his mind. "That's very admirable of her," he said, hiding his surprise. "Yeah, she's amazing." Sophie replied enthusiastically. "Mia told me her mom's been in pain, but she never complains. She's always there with a smile, no matter how hard things get." The words made Dr. Grant pause, something stirring within him, a flicker of unease that he quickly tried to push aside. "That's a good lesson, Sophie," he said softly, as if more to himself than to her. "Could we invite Mia and her mom over one day?" Sophie asked, her eyes filled with excitement. "I'd love for you to meet them." Dr. Grant hesitated, forcing a smile. "We'll see, honey. Now go work on that solar system project of yours." As Sophie bounded off, Dr. Grant found himself still thinking about Mia's mother. He couldn't shake the feeling that he might have overlooked something important. Yet he shrugged it off, returning his focus to his next day's schedule, unaware of the connection he'd just missed. Bookmark. Meanwhile, Paula's condition worsened with each passing day. The pain was relentless, radiating through her abdomen with every step. She did her best to hide her discomfort, especially from her young daughter, Mia, but it was becoming nearly impossible. One morning, as Mia prepared for school, she noticed her mother's pale face and the way she held her side, wincing slightly. Concerned, Mia asked, "Mom, are you okay? You look really tired." Paula forced a reassuring smile, though it barely reached her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little under the weather, that's all." But the truth was far from fine. Paula's body felt weak and achy, and each movement seemed to intensify the pain. At work, she found herself stopping more frequently to catch her breath, her hand gripping tables or walls for support. Her coworkers noticed her discomfort, her labored breathing, and the beads of sweat that often dotted her forehead, but Paula brushed off their concerns with a forced laugh. "I'm all right," she would say, even as her hands trembled. "Just a little worn out." One evening, as Paula was preparing dinner, a sudden, sharp pain shot through her abdomen. Gasping, she dropped a plate, which shattered on the floor. The sound brought Mia running into the kitchen. "Mom, are you okay?" Mia's voice was filled with worry as she looked at her mother, who was struggling to straighten up, her face pale and etched with pain. "Oh, silly me," Paula said, trying to laugh off the incident. "Just dropped a plate. Would you grab the broom for me, honey?" Mia hesitated, her gaze lingering on her mother's strained expression. "Are you sure you're okay?" "Of course, sweetie. Go finish your homework," Paula replied, her heart aching at the concern in her daughter's eyes. Later that night, after Mia had gone to bed, Paula sat alone at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She knew she needed medical help, but the thought of returning to Dr. Grant's clinic filled her with dread. His harsh words and dismissive tone echoed in her mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. "I can't go back there," she whispered to herself, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. "I just can't." But as another wave of pain rolled through her body, Paula realized that she might be out of options. She was stuck between her growing health crisis and the fear of facing the doctor who had turned her away. Feeling trapped and desperate, Paula closed her eyes, silently pleading for a way forward. A few days later, Paula's condition reached a breaking point. Despite the pain, she forced herself to go to work, not wanting to miss another day and risk her job. But this time, her body had other plans. She moved slower than usual, her face pale and her steps unsteady. Her co-workers watched with growing concern as she struggled to keep up with her duties. By mid-morning, Paula felt a stabbing pain in her abdomen so intense that she had to clutch the counter for support. Her vision blurred, and she felt as though the room was spinning. Just as she tried to steady herself, her coworker Jane noticed her struggling and rushed over. "Paula, are you okay?" Jane's voice was filled with alarm as she reached for Paula's arm. Paula opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The world around her seemed to fade as she felt her knees begin to buckle. I don't, was all she could manage before everything went dark and she collapsed to the floor. "Someone call an ambulance," the diner manager shouted, panic spreading among the staff and customers alike. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Paramedics arrived, assessing Paula's condition as she lay unconscious on the floor. They carefully lifted her onto a stretcher and quickly transferred her to the ambulance. As they sped toward the hospital, the paramedics worked urgently, aware of the severity of her symptoms. In the emergency room, doctors and nurses surrounded Paula, moving with precision and focus. Blood tests were taken, scans ordered, and within moments, her medical team was poring over the results, their expressions growing more serious as they reviewed each piece of information. Dr. Anna Lee, the lead physician on duty, frowned as she examined the findings. "This is more critical than we initially thought," she muttered to her team. "We need to admit her immediately and start preparing for emergency treatment." As they wheeled Paula toward the intensive care unit, she briefly regained consciousness, her eyes fluttering open in confusion and fear. The face of a kind nurse came into view, gently squeezing her hand. "Don't worry," the nurse said softly. "You're in good hands now. We'll contact your family." Paula managed a faint nod before slipping back into unconsciousness, her fate now resting in the hands of strangers she had never met. As the medical team rushed to stabilize her, every minute counted, and Paula's life hung in the balance. While Paula fought for her life, Dr. Grant was making his rounds at the hospital, entirely unaware of the crisis unfolding. As he scanned his patient list, he was approached by Dr. Anna Lee, who looked unusually tense. "Dr. Grant, we have a critical case I'd like your input on," she said, her voice urgent. Dr. Grant barely looked up from his clipboard, a hint of annoyance crossing his face. "What is it, Dr. Lee? I have a full schedule." Dr. Lee took a breath. "It's a woman named Paula Brown. She was admitted with severe abdominal pain and visible swelling. We believe it's a complex case and it may require surgical intervention." The name sounded familiar, but Dr. Grant couldn't place it immediately. "Paula Brown?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "What makes this case worth my time?" Just then, a nurse rushed up to them, her expression distressed. "Dr. Lee, the patient in room 305 is asking for her daughter. She's very agitated and keeps mentioning her little girl, Mia." At the mention of Mia's name, Dr. Grant froze. A wave of shock hit him as he realized the woman in room 305 was none other than Sophie's best friend's mother, the same woman he had dismissed so coldly at his clinic days earlier. His stomach twisted as the memory came flooding back. Paula sitting on the exam table, pleading with him for help, and his cruel dismissal. He remembered the look on her face, the desperation in her eyes. The realization was like a punch to the gut. "Dr. Grant?" Dr. Lee's voice snapped him back to the present. She was watching him closely, noting the unease in his expression. "Is everything all right?" He forced himself to stay composed, mind was racing. "Yes, of course," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Send me all her information. I'll review her case personally." Dr. Lee's expression softened with relief. "Thank you, Dr. Grant. We appreciate your expertise on this one." As she walked away, Dr. Grant stood frozen, staring blankly at the clipboard in his hands. The guilt crashed over him, an unbearable weight pressing down on his chest. How could he have been so blind? He had sworn an oath to help people, yet he'd let his prejudices cloud his judgment, putting Paula's life at risk. With a deep breath, Dr. Grant steadied himself, forcing his expression back to its usual impassiveness. He knew he couldn't let his colleagues see the turmoil roiling inside him. He would have to face the consequences of his actions, and he would start by doing everything in his power to help Paula, no matter the personal cost. Bookmark. That evening, Dr. Grant returned home only to be greeted by his daughter Sophie, her face flushed with worry. She rushed to him, her voice trembling. "Dad, something terrible happened," Sophie said, her eyes filled with panic. Dr. Grant felt his heart skip a beat. "What's wrong, Sophie? Are you okay?" "It's Mia's mom," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "She's in the hospital, and it's really bad. Mia is so scared she doesn't know what to do." Dr. Grant felt a wave of nausea as the weight of his earlier actions settled heavily on his shoulders. Struggling to maintain a neutral expression, he replied, "That's unfortunate. I'm sure the doctors are doing everything they can to help her." Sophie shook her head, her eyes filling with frustration. "Dad, you don't understand. Mia's mom is amazing. She works so hard to give Mia everything she needs. Did you know she works 2 jobs just to keep things going for them?" Caught off guard by Sophie's plea, Dr. Grant shifted uncomfortably. "No, I didn't know that," he murmured, guilt twisting inside him. "She's always helping others too," Sophie continued, her admiration clear. "When our neighbor Mrs. Jensen was sick last month, Mia's mom cooked for their whole family. She's so kind, Dad. She doesn't deserve this." As Sophie spoke, Dr. Grant felt an intense shame rise within him. He remembered Paula's weary face, her gentle demeanor, and the kindness Sophie was now describing. The woman he had so easily dismissed was far from the stereotype he'd assumed. She was a mother who sacrificed and cared for everyone around her, even when she was struggling. "I'm sure the doctors at the hospital will do their best," Dr. Grant said, his voice strained. But Sophie wasn't finished. Her eyes softened, turning pleading. "Dad, you're one of the best doctors. Couldn't you help her?" His heart clenched. Sophie had no idea about his previous interaction with Paula, or how he'd turned her away. He wanted to help, to make things right, but the shame of his earlier actions threatened to hold him back. After a long pause, he finally forced the words out, barely meeting his daughter's gaze. I'll see what I can find out," he managed, his voice low. Sophie's face lit up with a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Dad. Mia and her mom mean so much to me." As she walked away, Dr. Grant sat alone, wrestling with the conflict raging within him. Sophie's words echoed in his mind, challenging him to face the truth about himself. It was time to make a choice, confront his biases, and finally begin the journey toward becoming the doctor he should have been all along. The next morning, Dr. Grant entered the hospital with a weight heavier than ever pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't delay any longer. Paula's life was at stake, and he owed it to her and to himself to set things right. He walked into the conference room where the medical team treating Paula had already gathered. Their faces were serious as they studied her charts, each of them aware of the gravity of her condition. As Dr. Grant took a seat, his colleagues looked up in mild surprise. Dr. Grant wasn't known for getting deeply involved with patients like Paula. "Dr. Grant, thank you for joining us," one of the doctors said, handing him Paula's file. "We'd like your insights on her treatment options." Dr. Grant nodded stiffly, flipping open her file. His hands trembled slightly as he scanned the pages, each detail of Paula's symptoms now painfully clear. The swollen abdomen, the severe pain, and the exhaustion were all signs he had dismissed only days before. He felt his stomach drop as he read through the findings. A large ovarian tumor, with signs of advanced metastasis. "How far has it progressed?" Dr. Grant's voice came out rough, betraying the storm of emotions brewing beneath his controlled exterior. "Stage 3, replied the oncologist, her expression somber. "If we'd caught it earlier, her prognosis would have been much better. At this point, we're looking at aggressive treatment to give her any chance of survival." Dr. Grant felt the blood drain from his face. The weight of his negligence hit him full force, almost leaving him breathless. He had been so blinded by his prejudice that he'd failed Paula in the most fundamental way a doctor could, by refusing to help her when she'd needed him the most. "Dr. Grant, are you all right?" one of the younger doctors asked, concern in her voice. He realized he had been staring at the file, his hands shaking. For a moment he was overwhelmed by the shame and guilt suffocating him, but he knew he couldn't let it show. "Not here." Taking a steadying breath, he looked up at the team. "Yes, I'd like to take on this case personally," he announced, his voice more resolute than he felt inside. The room fell silent. Dr. Grant was not known for volunteering his time with complex, high-risk cases, especially those he had initially deemed unimportant. His colleagues exchanged surprised glances, but after a pause, they nodded in agreement. Despite everything, they trusted his skill. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Grant remained seated, still gripping Paula's file. The reality of his failure weighed heavily on him, but he resolved to do whatever it took to make things right. He would put everything into saving Paula, not just as a doctor, but as a man trying to atone for the pain he had caused. With a determined breath, Dr. Grant left the room, prepared to dedicate himself fully to Paula's case, even if it meant confronting his deepest flaws and acknowledging the harm his prejudice had done. Dr. Grant spent the next several days fully immersed in Paula's treatment, putting aside every other concern. He checked on her throughout the day, meticulously reviewing her test results and consulting with specialists to explore the most promising options. Yet, with each step, the weight of his regret grew heavier. One evening, after a long day, he lingered in the hallway outside Paula's room, staring at the door. He wanted to go in, to see her, to apologize. But the guilt was paralyzing, and the words he wanted to say seemed to escape him. Finally, gathering his courage, he stepped inside. Paula lay in bed, her face pale but her breathing steady. The hum of the machines around her was a stark reminder of the situation he had placed her in by ignoring her plea for help. As if sensing his presence, Paula's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, surprise flickering across her face. "Dr. Grant," she said weakly, her voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and confusion. Dr. Grant approached her bedside, swallowing the lump in his throat. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Brown?" he asked softly, his usual commanding tone replaced by something gentler, almost vulnerable. Paula hesitated, her gaze steady and calm. "A little better, I think," she replied, but there was a wary look in her eyes, a hesitation that spoke volumes. Dr. Grant took a deep breath. "Mrs. Brown, I owe you an apology," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "When you came to my clinic, I was wrong. I let my own biases get in the way of providing you with the care you deserved, and I failed you. I can't change what I did, but I promise you, I'm doing everything in my power now to help you recover." Paula looked at him in silence, her expression a mixture of surprise and thoughtfulness. She studied his face, searching for sincerity, and finally, after a long pause, nodded slowly. "Thank you, Dr. Grant," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I never expected to hear those words from you." Her acceptance of his apology touched him more deeply than he had anticipated. He felt the burden of his regret begins to ease, if only slightly. Dr. Grant realized then that while he couldn't erase the past, he had been given an opportunity to change, and he intended to make the most of it. As he left her room, he made a silent vow to Paula, to Sophie, and to himself. He would honor this second chance by transforming, not just as a doctor, but as a person. And from that moment on, he knew he would never let prejudice cloud his judgment again. Later that night, as Dr. Grant returned home, he found Sophie waiting for him in the living room, her face lined with concern. She looked up as he entered, and Dr. Grant could tell she'd been holding back a storm of questions. "Dad, can we talk?" she asked quietly. He nodded, sinking into the armchair across from her, his exhaustion visible. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Sophie took a steadying breath, meeting her father's gaze. "Dad, I know about Mia's mom," she began, her voice trembling. "Mia told me everything, how you treated her mom when she first came to see you." Dr. Grant felt his heart sink. He dreaded this moment, knowing that facing Sophie's disappointment would be harder than anything he'd encountered in the hospital. "Sophie, he started, his voice trailing off. Sophie held up a hand, signaling him to let her finish. "Dad, I know you're trying to make things right now, and that means a lot, but I need you to understand something important." Her eyes were filled with an unexpected wisdom and maturity. Dr. Grant nodded slowly, allowing her to continue. "A doctor's job isn't just about fixing people," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. "It's about caring for them, no matter who they are or where they come from. Every patient deserves kindness and respect. They're more than just symptoms, they're people, with lives and families." She paused, letting her words sink in. Her words hit him hard, each one like a painful reminder of how deeply he had failed Paula, and perhaps others like her. Dr. Grant's gaze dropped to the floor as he listened, realizing how much he'd neglected this fundamental truth. "You're right, Sophie," he said finally, his voice raw with emotion. "I've been wrong for a long time. I got so used to looking at patients as cases, as problems to solve, that I forgot to see them as people, and I've hurt people because of it." Sophie reached across the space between them, placing her hand on his. "Dad, it's not too late to change," she said, her voice softening. "I've seen how hard you're working to help me as mom. I'm proud of you for that. Just promise me you'll keep caring like this, for everyone." Dr. Grant felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of guilt and gratitude. He looked into Sophie's eyes, seeing the faith she still had in him despite everything. "I promise, Sophie. I'll do better. Not just for Paula, but for everyone who comes to me for help." A small smile spread across Sophie's face, her eyes bright with hope. "That's all I needed to hear, Dad." They sat together in silence, the words unspoken but understood between them. Dr. Grant realized that Sophie had just taught him one of the most profound lessons of his life. It wasn't only about healing Paula, it was about healing himself and becoming the doctor he had once aspired to be. The next morning, Dr. Grant arrived at the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. Sophie's words echoed in his mind, reminding him of the true calling of his profession. He no longer saw himself as merely a healer of bodies. He understood now that his role was to also care for souls, to treat each patient with the dignity they deserved. He spent the day overseeing Paula's care, staying close by to monitor her progress. Each decision he made was now weighed not only by his medical expertise, but also by a deeper sense of compassion he hadn't tapped into for years. By the afternoon, Dr. Grant gathered the entire medical team treating Paula in the conference room. He addressed them with a firmness softened by sincerity. "Thank you all for your work on this case. I know it's been challenging, and I appreciate your dedication. But I want us to go over Paula's situation from the beginning. No detail is too small, and no option is too insignificant. Let's make sure we're doing everything possible for her." The team looked at him with a mixture of surprise and admiration. They weren't used to seeing Dr. Grant so deeply invested, so involved in the smallest details of a case. One of the younger doctors, Dr. James Lynn, even hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Dr. Grant, it's inspiring to see how much you care. I've never seen you work like this." Grant offered a faint smile, a shadow of his usual professional demeanor. "Thank you, Dr. Lynn. This case has been eye-opening for me. We can't afford to make any mistakes here." Over the following days, Dr. Grant's transformation became the talk of the hospital. His colleagues, accustomed to his once aloof demeanor, watched as he checked on Paula late into the night, personally adjusting her treatment plan and consulting specialists from across the country to ensure she was receiving the most advanced care possible. One evening, as Dr. Grant sat by Paula's bedside, reviewing her latest test results, a nurse approached him, concern in her eyes. "Dr. Grant, you've been here for nearly 48 hours straight. Maybe you should take a break and get some rest." But Dr. Grant shook his head, his eyes focused on the chart in his hands. "I can't leave yet. There's more work to be done." The nurse placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, sensing the change in him. "You're doing everything you can, doctor. Paula is in good hands." Dr. Grant looked up, a mix of determination and remorse evident on his face. "I owe her this," he said quietly, "and I owe her so much more than that." As he turned back to Paula's resting form, he felt an unshakable resolve take hold of him. He wasn't just fighting to save her life, he was fighting to redeem his own. This journey wasn't only about Paula's recovery, it was about making amends, about proving to himself and to his family that he could be a better doctor, a better human. Dr. Grant's relentless dedication to Paula's case did not go unnoticed. Whispers began circulating among the hospital staff, with some expressing admiration, while others questioned his sudden change. Dr. Maria Santos, a fellow surgeon, pulled Dr. James Miller aside in the break room one afternoon. "Have you seen Dr. Grant lately?" Maria asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "He's like a different person. I've never seen him this committed to a patient before." Dr. Miller nodded, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "It's strange, isn't it? It's as if he's had some kind of awakening. Do you think it has to do with his daughter?" "I heard Paula's daughter is close friends with his. Maria replied, tapping her chin. Maybe this case hit closer to home than he expected. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Lisa Chen, who had overheard them. "I'm working on Paula's case with Dr. Grant," she chimed in. "It seems genuine to me. He's been pulling all-nighters, consulting with every specialist he can find. I've never seen him work so hard." Maria raised an eyebrow, still skeptical. "Maybe he's just trying to repair his reputation. You know how much his image means to him." But as the days passed, even the doubters among the staff began to sense the authenticity in Dr. Grant's dedication. He was constantly at Paula's side, personally reviewing her medications, making adjustments to her treatment plan, and ensuring that every possible resource was being used to give her the best shot at recovery. His shift in priorities and approach became an example for the younger doctors, who watched him in quiet admiration. One evening, as Dr. Grant left Paula's room after a late-night check, he overheard two nurses whispering in the hallway. "He's only doing this because it's personal," one of them muttered. "He wouldn't go this far for anyone else." For a moment, Dr. Grant felt a flicker of defensiveness rises within him. But then he remembered his past behavior. They had every reason to doubt his motives, and he couldn't blame them for it. He took a deep breath, straightened his white coat, and walked past the nurses with a polite nod, choosing not to let their words distract him. After all, this was no longer about what others thought of him. It was about making things right, no matter how many hours it took or how many eyes were on him. Paula's life depended on it, and he was determined to fight for her recovery with everything he had. In those long, quiet hours at the hospital, Dr. Grant realized that his commitment had already started to ripple through the hospital. His team's trust in him was slowly being restored, and their collective dedication to Paula's case became a shared mission, one that redefined what it meant to work together in the name of compassion and healing. As Dr. Grant continued to pour himself into Paula's recovery, his family noticed his growing absence at home. Late one evening, after another exhausting day at the hospital, he walked through the door to find his wife, Laura, waiting for him in the kitchen. The warm aroma of her home-cooked meal filled the air, but Dr. Grant's mind was still wrapped around Paula's case. "Stephen," Laura said softly, her hand resting on his arm. "You've been so distant lately. What's going on?" Grant sank into a chair, his shoulders sagging as he ran a hand through his hair. I made a terrible mistake, Laura," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I could have cost someone their life because of my own stubbornness, my prejudices." Laura sat beside him, her brow furrowed in concern. "Tell me," she urged, her voice gentle. Taking a deep breath, Dr. Grant recounted everything, the moment he dismissed Paula at his clinic, the prejudices that had clouded his judgment, and the weight of guilt that now consumed him. His voice shook with emotion as he continued. "I thought I was better than that, Laura, but I hurt her, and now I have to fix it somehow." Laura listened intently, her hand never leaving his as he poured out his heart. When he finished, she squeezed his hand and said softly, "We all make mistakes, Stephen. What matters is that you're trying to make things right now. That's what's important." He looked at her, surprised by her understanding. "You're not disappointed in me?" Laura shook her head, her eyes filled with warmth. "Disappointment would be if you didn't care, if you didn't try to change. This journey you're on now, it's what I've always admired most about you, the part of you that wants to help people." Dr. Grant felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Laura's words reminded him of the man he had always aspired to be but had lost sight of in his climb up the professional ladder. He took a deep breath, a renewed sense of purpose forming within him. "I want to do better, Laura. Not just for Paula, but for every patient who walks into my office. I want to be the kind of doctor who truly cares." Laura smiled, her eyes glistening. "That's the man I fell in love with, Stephen, and I believe in you." Over the next several weeks, Dr. Grant's resolve only grew stronger. He continued to stay by Paula's side, carefully monitoring her progress and making adjustments to her care as needed. Slowly but surely, Paula's health began to improve. Her abdominal swelling reduced, her energy returned, and the pallor that had once dominated her face was replaced with a healthier glow. One afternoon, as Dr. Grant was checking her vitals, Paula opened her eyes and looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and lingering curiosity. "Dr. Grant," she whispered, her voice still weak. "Why are you doing all this?" Dr. Grant pulled up a chair, meeting her gaze with newfound humility. "Because I owe you, Paula. I owe you for the care I didn't give you when you needed it. And because I've learned that being a doctor is more than just a skill or a title. It's about seeing each person fully with respect." Paula's eyes filled with tears. She had never expected such an apology, much less this level of care from a doctor who had once dismissed her so callously. "Thank you, Dr. Grant," she said softly, "for everything." Dr. Grant felt a lump in his throat, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his own humanity. "You don't need to thank me," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been this doctor from the start." As he left her room that day, Dr. Grant knew that he was finally on a path not only to redemption, but to becoming the doctor he was always meant to be. Months passed, and Paula's health steadily improved under Dr. Grant's dedicated care. Each visit to her room, each compassionate interaction, helped him reconnect with the values he'd long forgotten. His journey with Paula had not only transformed his view of his profession, but had begun to ripple throughout the entire hospital. One day, Dr. Grant called a meeting with the hospital's leadership. His colleagues were curious, even skeptical, as they gathered in the conference room, waiting for him to speak. Dr. Grant cleared his throat, his voice calm but determined. "Thank you all for being here. Today, I want to discuss a new initiative that I believe is long overdue. I want us to create a clinic that provides free medical care to those who cannot afford it." The room went silent, and a ripple of surprise spread among his peers. Dr. Elena Garcia, one of the senior surgeons, raised an eyebrow. "Stephen, this is unexpected. What brought this on?" Dr. Grant met her gaze, his expression steady. "I've recently come to understand the barriers many people face just to receive basic care. I believe it's our duty as medical professionals to help bridge that gap. This clinic would be a way for us to give back to the community and to ensure that no one is turned away because of their circumstances." His words were met with a mixture of responses. Some of his colleagues nodded in agreement, while others appeared uncertain. But slowly, as Dr. Grant explained his vision, outlining his plans for staffing and funding, the initial skepticism began to dissolve. Dr. Maya Chen, a young resident, was the first to speak up. "I think it's a brilliant idea, Dr. Grant. I'd be honored to volunteer my time at the clinic." One by one, other doctors and nurses began to voice their support. Dr. Garcia, who had initially questioned the proposal, finally nodded. "Count me in. This is exactly the kind of project we should be dedicating ourselves to." As the meeting concluded, Dr. Grant felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. He knew this clinic would be more than just a building. It would be a symbol of his commitment to change and a new standard for compassionate care. A few months later, the clinic opened its doors. A freshly painted sign hung above the entrance, bearing the name Hope Health Clinic. It was a simple, welcoming space designed to feel safe and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, intimidating hospitals many people feared. As Dr. Grant arrived early on opening day, he was greeted by the sight of a line forming outside. Families with young children, elderly couples, and individuals from every background, all waiting for a chance to receive the care they had long needed. Dr. Grant addressed the crowd, his voice resonating with sincerity. "Welcome to Hope Health Clinic. We are here to help, and every one of you deserves the best care we can offer." The first patient to enter was an elderly woman with a warm smile. She shook Dr. Grant's hand and whispered, "Thank you, doctor. I've been needing care for months but couldn't afford it." "You're in the right place now," Dr. Grant replied gently. "We'll take care of you." Throughout the day, he and his team worked tirelessly, treating everything from minor ailments to more serious conditions, each patient given the time and attention they deserved. Dr. Grant's colleagues watched as he treated each person with genuine warmth and compassion, a far cry from the impersonal manner he once had. As evening approached, Dr. Grant took a moment to step outside for fresh air. The sight of the clinic, bustling with patients and volunteers, filled him with a sense of peace. He realized this was more than just a clinic, It was a legacy of redemption and compassion, a place where he could honor every lesson he'd learned through his journey with Paula. Just as he was about to go back inside, he saw a familiar face at the reception desk. Paula, standing hand in hand with Mia, smiling proudly at the clinic that had been inspired by her strength and resilience. Years later, on a bright summer afternoon, the town gathered in the local auditorium for a special occasion, Mia's high school graduation. Dr. Grant sat among the audience, feeling a swell of pride as he watched Mia, now a poised young woman, prepare to walk across the stage. Beside him, Sophie beamed with excitement, her friendship with Mia having grown even stronger over the years. As the ceremony began, the principal took the podium and introduced the guest speaker, Paula. Dr. Grant felt his heart skip as he watched Paula, healthy and radiant, approach the stage with grace. She looked out at the audience, her gaze briefly finding Dr. Grant's before she began her speech. "Good evening, everyone," Paula said, her voice clear and steady. "Today, I'm not just here as Mia's mother, but as someone who has witnessed the power of empathy and redemption." She paused, letting her words settle over the audience. "Several years ago, I faced a health crisis that nearly took my life. I was scared, struggling, and felt completely alone. But something remarkable happened. A doctor who had once dismissed me had a change of heart. He saved my life, but more importantly, he showed me the true meaning of compassion." Dr. Grant felt a lump form in his throat, and he blinked back tears as Paula continued. "That doctor is here with us today," Paula said, her eyes softening as they met his. "Dr. Stephen Grant and his team didn't just save my life, they created Hope Health Clinic, a place where people can receive care regardless of their circumstances. This clinic has become a beacon of compassion in our community, a place where every life is valued." The audience broke into applause, many glancing at Dr. Grant with admiration. He felt Sophie's hand slip into his, her eyes brimming with pride. In that moment, he realized the full extent of his transformation, not just as a doctor, but as a person who had finally learned the meaning of service and humility. As the applause faded, Paula turned her attention to the graduating class, her voice warm and encouraging. "To all of you starting your journeys, remember this: empathy has the power to change lives, to heal in ways that medicine alone cannot. Let compassion guide you, and you'll make the world a better place." Dr. Grant listened, deeply moved, reflecting on how far he had come and how many lives he had touched along the way. After the ceremony, as families gathered to celebrate, Paula approached him, Mia by her side. She extended her hand, a smile of genuine gratitude on her face. "Thank you, Dr. Grant," she said softly, "for everything." Dr. Grant shook her hand, his own expression filled with emotion. "No, Paula," he replied. "Thank you for teaching me what it truly means to care." As Mia hugged him and Sophie looked on with pride, Dr. Grant knew that his journey of redemption had come full circle. His past mistakes had led him to a future filled with purpose, and now, surrounded by friends and family, he felt a peace he had never known before. The Hope Health Clinic would stand as his legacy, a place where every patient was seen, valued, and treated with the compassion they deserved, a reminder that true healing begins with the heart. The journey of Dr. Grant is a powerful reminder of the transformative power of compassion and humility. Moving from a cold, dismissive doctor to someone who genuinely cares for each patient, Dr. Grant's story shows us that change is always possible, no matter how deep-rooted our flaws might be. Through the pain of Paula's struggle and the heartfelt words of his daughter Sophie, he is forced to confront his own prejudice and the harm it causes. Those mistakes lead him onto a new path, not just in his career, but in his entire outlook on life. The greatest lesson in this story is the importance of empathy and humility in our roles, whatever they may be. For Dr. Grant, his role as a doctor is no longer simply about treating illnesses. It's about listening, understanding, and seeing each patient as a person worthy of dignity and respect. His journey shows that genuine transformation can come when we choose to care, not just out of duty, but out of love and compassion for others. In building the Hope Health Clinic, Dr. Grant didn't just save Paula's life. He created a lasting legacy of care, a space where every person, regardless of their background, could receive the help they needed. This story is a reminder that even the most closed-off hearts can open, And sometimes, our mistakes can be the strongest force for positive change in our lives. If you found this story meaningful, press 1 in the comments. If you found it deeply moving, press 2. We'd also love to hear your own stories of change and compassion. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our upcoming inspiring stories. Share your thoughts about this story in the comments below.